Hey Les, great to see you.
Great to see you, John.
Yeah, I'm really glad to see the progress with the Metal Minds podcast. 50 sessions is rather remarkable, I think. And I know that there's in that an exceptional accumulation of knowledge and experience and insight on the topic. And I thought at this point it would be good to take a pause and maybe look back on the project and try to think through where it was at the beginning, where it is now. And along those regards, I had some thoughts just in the form of questions that I thought I would just try to send your way and just see what your comments are.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate the opportunity, John, both to reflect on the podcast, but also I think your questions have given me a chance to reflect on our work and our projects over the years, and just also on our interactions. And for people who are watching, it was back in 2006 when I was completing my doctoral studies, and you were marking my dissertation. And it's been a real honor and privilege, I guess, to work with you over the past 15 or so years, and I've really enjoyed our interaction. So yeah, glad to have the chance to meet and chat.
Oh, thanks a lot. So, well, let's go to the beginning. What was the original concept behind the podcast? What were you thinking? What were you trying to achieve?
Yeah, so my background is as an academic, and I've been working at the University of Utah now for the past 10 years, and have been in academia really since 2006, so about 15 years. And I guess as academics, our incentive is to really produce research and to publish that research in academic outlets. And while that production of knowledge is really important, sometimes we don't always, I think, as academics, do a great job of translating that material into digestible content that athletes or practitioners can use. And the other thing is, we're often sort of, as I say, incentivized, I guess, to publish, but we don't always kind of go beyond that and necessarily translate that information or provide forums where it can be easily accessed. And so I think the idea behind the podcast was really just to provide a forum or an area where athletes, coaches, sport medicine providers could get access to credible and expert knowledge from people who are working with athletes, from researchers and practitioners, and also from athletes themselves. And so that was kind of the original impetus, I guess, for the project. But it's also been an opportunity, I guess, to share that knowledge and the stories with athletes who are affected by injury. And for many injured athletes, when they hear stories that can resonate with them, or they hear the stories of others, that can be really powerful and useful information to help act as kind of role models for them. So I think that was another important kind of motivation. The last part of that is, you and I have been working the past few years to develop a program in particular for injured athletes that helps them deal with the multitude of challenges that injury presents. And part of our idea or goal was to use some of the content from the interviews and incorporate that into a psychological skills program to help athletes develop and cultivate some of the skills that can help them manage the range of injury challenges.
Yeah, sounds great. I know not too long ago I attended American Psychological Association advocacy seminar, and uh, as much central to the message as anything is the idea of getting information to the public, getting information to people that can use it, because there is this kind of gap between science and implementation, and between concept and practical understanding. And so I think that the podcast goes a long way to start to accomplish that objective.
Yeah. And yeah, I agree completely. And yesterday I was speaking with Lori Olson. She's a physical therapist at Utah State University. And it was really nice to hear her indicate that she had really benefited from watching the podcast herself. And I had interviewed her some months ago, and she mentioned that for her it was an opportunity to get validation of her own practices and the things that she does with her athletes. But also it was a learning tool for her as well, that she could pick up ideas and strategies and suggestions from other practitioners in her field. So I feel like it's been a great opportunity to get information out that's really credible, and to have individuals who have a lot of expertise.
Yeah, I would also add that by virtue of those who have participated, it's become interdisciplinary, which is another future trend in science where the sciences blend and work together better. I think we provide better services and better understanding when we do things in that way.
Yeah, well, and I agree completely. I mean, I think, in terms of the psychology of sport injury, and, we'll probably talk a bit more about this, I feel like we've often been very siloed, and we kind of tend to work with researchers in our field or practitioners, sports psychologists. But injury, if nothing else, is very much a mind-body challenge. And, it affects, of course, people's physical functioning, but it can impact their physiology, their movement patterns. And so I think injury really represents a great opportunity for researchers in different areas to work together, but also scholars and practitioners. And I think, as you said, that's really the way in which we can move both the academic field of the psychology of injury forward, as well as the applied practice of kind of working with athletes.
So let me ask this then. We've identified what the hopes and the expectations were. How do you feel the program has been meeting those expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like it's, if anything, exceeded many original expectations. And, as I reflect on the interviews that I've done, I feel really fortunate to have spoken with people, as I alluded to a second ago, that really have a lot of expertise. And, I've spoken to Olympic champions, Olympians, practitioners, physical therapists, sports psychologists who have tremendous experience working with athletes, but also people from different continents and backgrounds. I've spoken to individuals in Australia, Europe, North America, the UK, Qatar. So it's really been great. And I don't think I anticipated or expected that I would necessarily have the chance to speak to people. And I think, maybe one positive from the pandemic is people are more commonly using platforms that enable us to connect with people in diverse locations. So I think it's really exceeded expectations in that way. But also just, I would say, in terms of the quality of the content that people provide. And, I've in many ways been, I guess you could say, surprised or just really satisfied and impressed with people's willingness to give of their time, but also, the quality of the information that people are sharing. And I think, again, that really sort of means that what is being put out is really credible, and people are giving very kind of detailed and nuanced answers. And so I think that's helpful for the practitioner or the athlete or the sports psychologist who listens to the podcast.
I would imagine with that many interviews over that period of time and with such a diverse group of individuals, there must have been some kind of surprises or aha moments along the way. And I was wondering if there's any that stand out for you.
Yeah, great question. So I mentioned kind of my background as a researcher and educator. And one of the things in research that we're always clear about doing is to let people know that when they're involved in a research study, that their answers are confidential and that we protect their anonymity. And maybe it's just because I'm a bit antiquated with technology or my thinking, but it just as a sort of a broader reflection or thought, I guess it always surprises me a little bit that people are willing to share their experiences publicly. But I think that's really important because as we were talking about, if unfortunately, coaches or athletes, they're probably not going to academic journals to access information, but they may be apt or prone to listen to a podcast. And I think, as I think about specific interviews where I interviewed a three-time world champion, Amber Halliday, and she talked about her experiences, her struggles after she had a traumatic bike injury, actually, and she got hit by a car, and she was in the hospital and unconscious for a long period of time, and she really talked about her own personal challenges and struggles in coming to terms with the injury, and it wasn't just something that affected her career as an athlete, but her life as a whole. And when people really kind of share that information, I mean, I think that's something that again, I guess comes as a pleasant surprise in a way. I guess the other thing, and I don't know if it's so much a surprise or necessarily a reflection, but I also see a lot of consistency in terms of people's comments and the content that they offer. So whether I'm speaking with an athlete or a practitioner, they often highlight some consistent elements. So for instance, a lot of practitioners have talked about the importance of athletes taking ownership over their injury recovery. And in a couple interviews that I did, I interviewed a fellow named Ted Polglaze, who was a bobsledder, and he represented Australia in the 1998 Nagano Olympics. And recently I was interviewing a fellow named Dale Forsdyke, who's a lecturer in sport injury management at York St. John in the UK. And he works with women's soccer there as well. And they both use this term that, athletes, it's helpful when they think of themselves as the CEO of their injury recovery. And so this idea that, you're in control to a certain extent of what's happening with your recovery by adopting a certain mindset, by engaging in certain behaviors. And so, I noticed particularly a lot of practitioners talk about the role that athletes can take. There's also consistency, I would say, in terms of the emphasis on the role of the environment or the kind of interactions that athletes have with practitioners or with other injury stakeholders. So topics like, getting the right kind or amount of social support is something that's consistently emerged. So I think, again, I don't know if that's a surprise specifically, but it's just something that an observation in terms of the consistency of responses that I notice. And I guess like one other thing would also be that, I suppose we're always, assuming that there is an importance to the psychological component. But I find when I hear athletes, for instance, talk about, very specific ways in which the psychological aspects of injury or of their sport performance is relevant to them, then I see that as very validating. And I'll just maybe relay an anecdote here on that. Years ago, I had the good fortune of traveling to Sweden, and in recent years, a colleague, Henrik Gustafsson. He's done a lot of work on burnout. And I was visiting Karlstad, which is the town in Sweden where Henrik works, and I was speaking to his class. And I was telling them that, I felt a little bit of a connection to Sweden because when I was growing up in Calgary, we had a Swedish player on the Calgary Flames named Håkan Loob. And in the 80s, Loob was one of the most skillful players in the NHL. In 1989, he helped the Calgary Flames win the Stanley Cup. In 88, I believe it was, he became the first Swedish player to score 50 goals. And so, when I was growing up in Calgary, it was pretty, he was like a boyhood idol, kind of. As a Canadian, we all love watching ice hockey. And so I was sharing this with the class. And at the time, I didn't realize that Loob was had actually played for Karlstad. They had an ice hockey team there that won a number of championships in the Swedish National Hockey League, and that he had been the manager of the team for a number of years as well. So, my friend Henrik heard me relay this anecdote to the class, and then as he was dropping me at the train station, he said, "Oh, I just have to run an errand." And I was like, "Okay." And I think he said something like, "I have to go to the supermarket or something." So he pulled up to this building that looked nothing like a supermarket. We go in and we're at the hockey arena. I'm like, "What are we doing here?" And then we go up to the top floor and he said, "Les, I'd like you to meet Håkan Loob." And for the better part of the next 45 minutes or hour, I got the chance to chat with him. And he was just a very humble, lovely, and intelligent individual. And so when we started doing the podcast months ago, I reached out to my colleague, Henrik, and another colleague of his, and they were kind enough to put me in touch with Håkan Loob. And when I got the chance to speak with Håkan Loob for one of the podcasts, it was really wonderful to hear him talk about just how important psychology was, not just for him not just when he was injured, but also for him as an athlete. And he really highlighted wonderful examples of how he used imagery or visualization to place himself in different situations and to use it as a tool so that he felt prepared and he felt confident, because he said, "I knew I had already been in these situations numerous times." And so, I guess going back to my point a minute ago, it's really kind of validating, I would say, and I suppose makes you feel positive about the work that we do as sports psychologists and as scholars and researchers when you hear that top level athletes use these psychological skills and they incorporate them. So I think that's been really kind of rewarding, if not, maybe not surprising, but really satisfying and gratifying.
Let's try to take maybe a longer view. What I'd like to ask you to do is try to think back when you were a graduate student, first coming into the field, and reflect back on what was happening then in the field, what was going on, and what perhaps wasn't going on that maybe should have been.
Yeah. So, I guess I started my doctoral studies back in 2002. And so almost 20 years ago. And I would say that certainly in terms of the research component of our field, that a lot of the work on the psychological aspects of injury was very descriptive. So, we had reports to say, well, injured athletes get frustrated after they get injured, or, they have a lot of negative thoughts in the aftermath of injury, or findings to kind of look maybe at specific psychological factors that might either increase the athlete's injury risk or that may impact their recovery. But so I would say that a lot of the research was very descriptive 20 years ago rather than explanatory. So, it might maybe, researchers would often do kind of one-time interviews or cross-sectional kinds of studies where they would, look at two psychological variables at a single point in time. So I'll give you a concrete example. When I started my doctoral studies, one of the things that I was interested in was this idea of motivation. And it seemed that, ultimately at the core of recovery from injury was an athlete's drive or motivation to do so. And motivation is a broad concept. I guess it not only refers to how much energy people put into tasks, but also why they do it. And so in one of my studies, we asked athletes who had already returned to sport what their motivation, we asked them to reflect back on prior to their return to sport and to think back about what was driving them to return. Why were they coming back? So we gave them a questionnaire that asked them about their motivation to return to play after injury. And then we developed another questionnaire or assessment to measure their perception of how they were performing after the injury, right? So these were already athletes that had recovered, but again, we asked them to think back and we said, like prior to your injury or once you got hurt, what were your motivations to come back and play your sport again? And then in that same study, we gave them another questionnaire that asked them to think back, said, okay, now we want you to reflect on how you're performing after you return to sport. So, that study, while it provided some insight into the role of motivation in terms of what influence motivation during recovery might have on their post-injury performance, it's just a snapshot where we're asking athletes about their perceptions at at a particular point in time. Or in this case, we're asking them to reflect back on what they were thinking. Now, that can be problematic for a variety of reasons, right? Like people's memory obviously can decay or become flawed over time, but also the outcomes of events can maybe alter your perception of what actually you may have been thinking at a previous point in time, right? So maybe the athlete who was really struggling with their motivation or felt like, they weren't maybe intrinsically motivated to do it, but then once they come back and they start competing, then maybe they feel like they had a really positive outcome. So maybe the fact that they had a positive outcome in some way skews or alters their perceptions of, what their motivation would have been had you asked them at the time they were recovering. So I guess, to kind of bring home my point, I think a lot of the research initially was very, like we would get sort of one-time interviews, or we would ask athletes at one particular point in time to make reflections about sort of previous thoughts or appraisals or motivations in this case. And, that, as I've suggested, has its limitations. And so, I think work has grown, and, I can certainly talk a little bit more about how the field has evolved over time. But I think, one other comment would be that we had a couple of models, in particular models looking at injury risk and what causes athletes to get hurt, but also factors that may influence their recovery. But 20 years ago, we didn't really have a lot of research that actually tested those assumptions or those proposed relationships. So I think we've definitely grown since then, and again, happy to kind of chat more about that. But yeah.
Well, so flash forward from then till now, what's the state of the art now? What's come forward from then, and what's happened otherwise along the way that defines what the state of the art is in providing treatment for the psychology of sport injury?
Yeah. So I guess just broadly speaking, a lot of the research has fallen into three areas. And I mentioned the psychological factors that predict injury, psychosocial factors that influence the process of recovery or the quality and effectiveness of athletes' rehabilitation. And then a third broad area is kind of looked at the return to play and factors that may influence the transition when the athlete finishes their rehab and as they're coming back into competitive activities. Most of the work in terms of injury risk factors has looked at acute musculoskeletal injury. And I would say recently there's maybe more of a shift to looking not just at factors that predict those acute instances, but also chronic injury. And there may be some different mechanisms at play that underline, like, why is it that maybe individuals are susceptible to getting chronic or ongoing injury. In the case of the acute injury, there's certainly substantial research to show that stress can play a key role. So, we know that when an athlete gets stressed, it has changes or it has implications for their attention. So, they may get what we call like a narrowing of the peripheral vision, or what's commonly called tunnel vision. So sort of, the quarterback who's really stressed and can only see straight ahead and fails to see that lineman rushing them and trying to tackle them, may be more susceptible to getting hurt because they, don't have the ability to take cues in the periphery. But also when we get stressed, we tend to have task irrelevant thoughts, right? So I may be thinking, well, I shouldn't have dropped that pass, or the coach isn't happy with me, or I keep messing up. And when we're not absorbed or immersed in the task at hand, we're more susceptible to getting hurt. But in the case of chronic injury, some of those attentional mechanisms that are the result of stress may not be so pivotal in inducing more chronic kinds of injury. So it may be more like personality traits. For instance, if you feel compelled, or you feel like you have to continue training even if you're in pain, or there may be cultural elements where athletes feel that they have to be tough. And so I think currently, and certainly in terms of injury risk, we're gaining and have gained a lot of insight into factors that increase acute injury, but also chronic injury. I think there's also some really neat work being done in terms of the rehabilitation timeframe. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of the research was very descriptive. And I think now we're coming to a much clearer understanding of maybe the reasons why certain factors or interventions might actually help facilitate recovery. So I'll just give an example of a study that I think is very cutting edge in terms of rehabilitation. Often when we think of muscle function, researchers look at the role of a muscle mass in terms of muscle's ability to activate and to execute. But Brian Clark and a number of colleagues were interested in the potential role of the nervous system, specifically the neocortex. And so they did this wonderful study looking at the impact of imagery on muscle activation and muscle strength. And essentially what they did in the study was they had individuals, they put them in a cast. And of course, when your arm is immobilized, in this case for a period of 4 weeks, there's a lot of atrophy that occurs. And so they had some individuals who had their arm in a cast for 4 weeks, and they did essentially nothing over the course of the 4-week period. And then there was another group that did imagery. And essentially what they had them do was just imagine their forearm contracting. They did that, I think it was 5 times a day. And in each session, they had to just imagine their arm contracting 52 times. And they did that over the course of the 4-week period of immobilization. And then they tested the athletes before their arm was immobilized on their grip strength. and then at the end of the 4-week period. And they also tested them on what's called voluntary activation, which reflects the nervous system's ability to activate muscle. And it's been shown that voluntary activation is reduced or compromised when muscle is experimentally immobilized. So, as I mentioned, for example, when you have someone put their arm in a cast, this voluntary activation is reduced. And what they found was that the group that did the imagery, they had 50% less, or it attenuated or reduced muscle wastage compared to the group that did no imagery. So in both groups, over the course of the 4-week period, they lost muscle strength and muscle function. But the group that did the imagery had 50% less muscle wastage. Their strength was maintained at 50% higher than the group that just had their arm immobilized. And what they found was that the reason why this may be occurring is that it has something to do with the neocortex, because again, the group that did the imagery, they weren't actually engaging in strength exercises. They were literally just imagining their muscle activating. And so, what I think is really neat about this study is it's showing the reason that there are mechanisms why, or the means by which some of the strategies that we use as sports psychologists can actually make a difference literally on physical function. And I also think it gets to your earlier point, John, about the fact that, we often can be, we don't always work in a very multidisciplinary way. And so to do that kind of cutting edge research not only requires expertise and knowledge from sports psychologists who know about imagery, but also neuroscientists. Or if we want to do studies that, for instance, look at, say, the role of fear and how that might impact movement mechanics, we need the expertise not only of sports psychologists who understand, cognitions and emotions, but also biomechanists who understand movement patterns and functional movement. And so I think that, the field is certainly emerging from some of that very early descriptive work to more kind of interventions that help us understand also why these strategies work, and also that kind of bring together researchers from different fields.
Okay, could you expand a little bit then on the translation of these increasingly well understood and well-founded ideas about rehabilitation from a psychological perspective, from the research setting to the field, to the actual practice?
Well, I guess I spoke a little bit about this. I think, as researchers, sometimes I feel like we fall a little bit short in terms of that piece, in terms of translating these findings and finding avenues or venues to get that information out in ways that's digestible and understandable to practitioners. I think, in order to kind of move the applied field of the psychology of injury forward, I think that's something that's critically important to do. And again, I think, the part of the rationale for the Mettle Mind podcast is to get to have people who are working, doing the research, working with athletes, and also athletes themselves to get that information out, so that we aren't just publishing it in academic journals. And I'm not criticizing that. I think that's important, but I would say it's just one step in the process. And if we don't then take further steps to get that information out, to have opportunities where researchers are getting in front of physiotherapists or giving talks to coaches, and maybe it's coach education programs, or it could be forums on the internet, individual talks or sessions, then I think we're not really getting the full picture. And so I think those translation efforts and efforts to bridge the science and the practice are really important. And I think we're starting to make progress, but I see certainly opportunities to make further progress in that area.
Could you perhaps talk briefly about our study at the University of Utah with the athletes and the training program and so forth?
Yeah, sure. So, I mentioned this idea of psychological skills, and in the world of sports psychology, we like to think that just as one can train physical skills and hone their ability to execute sport specific tasks, that one can also improve things like their ability to manage pain or to regulate thoughts and emotions, or to enhance motivation. All of those things can certainly be impaired in the case of an injured athlete. And so in the study that yourself and I and some athletic training staff and collaborators here at the University of Utah did, we had a fairly small sample. We had 16 individuals, and our idea was really to give them some cognitive behavioral skills and to see what impact, if any, those might have in terms of the quality or effectiveness of athletes' rehabilitation. So what do I mean by the quality or effectiveness? Well, ultimately, the aim of our study was to see whether these psychological skills in terms of pain management, giving athletes education and information about the nature of their injury. We also gave them tools to manage and sort of help them reframe some of their negative thoughts, which can be quite common in the aftermath of an injury. Whether these skills would help them in terms of their emotions. So, again, there's a lot of descriptive research to show that, not surprisingly, in the aftermath of an injury, an athlete can be very frustrated. It may affect their sense of self-esteem, their energy levels. And so we wanted to look at their three things. What impact would this psychological skills program have on their well-being, their adherence to the program? So presumably, if you feel, like, okay, this is frustrating, but I see that, there's the possibility that I can have a positive return to play, or that I can make progress, or that I can influence this recovery. If you have more positive thoughts and emotions, then presumably that will influence your recovery behaviors. So one behavior that's particularly important that we looked at in our study is the extent to which athletes adhere or comply with the rehabilitation program. There's a whole body of literature that suggests that if athletes are following evidence-based programs, if they do, engage in the recommended number of exercises, but they don't do too much, if they put in energy and effort and show up to their show up first of all, but then when they show up to their rehabilitation sessions, they put in energy and effort. If they do things like communicate their pain, but then they also, try and work through that pain, that's kind of broadly what we refer to as adherence to the rehab program. And presumably, if they adhere to the rehab program, then that will have beneficial implications for their clinical function. They'll be able to execute motor movements, tasks more optimally. And so what we did was we recruited a total of 16 athletes. In one group, they just did their physical rehabilitation. In another group, they had their physical rehabilitation plus the skills that I referred to earlier. And then we tracked them over time. And that was another thing that I talked about earlier as sort of a limitation of past research. And I think, in this study, we asked athletes about their emotions, their adherence, and their functional capabilities at 3 time points: when they entered into rehabilitation, at the midpoint of or the estimated midpoint of their recovery, and then at the end when they were medically cleared. And what we found was that there were significant differences. The group that got the psychological skills intervention had consistently higher positive emotions and more and less negative emotions. We found that adherence, although it was higher for the group that got the psychological skills, the difference between that group and the group that just did their physical recovery was not statistically significant or reliable, but there was still a difference in the expected direction. So the group that got the psychological skills, the athletic trainers reported that they had higher levels of adherence. And so, I think these findings are important, certainly in terms of the well-being findings about their emotions, their moods. We assess their vitality or their energy levels, because there's a lot of science that shows that emotion can be a very powerful driver of behavior. But also, there's also increasing evidence to show that emotions impact our physiology, right? And so if the athlete is experiencing a predominance of negative emotions and they can't get over that frustration, then that can affect their blood flow and their hormones. So maybe cortisol goes up or testosterone goes down. That can impede or impact their healing capabilities. So, I think that study provides some nice evidence that when you train these skills and you provide them to athletes in a systematic way, that it can benefit athletes' rehabilitation.
Yeah, let me just sort of reflect a little bit and pose another question. And what I want to reflect on is the idea of skill versus therapy. Skill being something that's taught and practiced. Psychotherapy, more typically understood as something that's kind of interactive and more receptive. And that's probably a little bit of a strong argument for psychotherapy, because in a way it is active. But again, the whole idea of skills in the recovery process, as opposed to something that's people sometimes summarize mental health interventions as having a positive attitude or dealing better with your emotions, but aren't able to drill down on specific steps to make that happen, or
Yeah.
certainly not to the extent that you would see in a skill-based approach.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, John, that distinction is important in that, often I think this probably perception of sports psychology as a whole is changing, but, certainly traditionally, that if you were going to see a psychologist, that, you must have something wrong with you, or there's this notion of deficit in some way. And therefore you need psychotherapy or treatment for your deficit. Whereas the notion of skill is something that, I think all athletes are probably going to have some level of frustration when they get injured, for instance. And that they don't have to be experiencing clinical levels or something that's necessarily problematic to still want to optimize their skill of how do I shape or manage motivation, because rehabilitation, particularly for prolonged injuries, can be tedious and boring, and or the skill of pain management can be critically important. When you're having an acute injury, certainly in the initial aftermath, there's pain, and being able to distinguish, well, what is more benign from more sinister forms of pain can be a really important quality that or skill that athletes can develop. Not only does it help them with their recovery, but certainly can translate to their performance following injury. So I think that distinction is important to make.
Okay, what next? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I guess I've maybe highlighted some of that in some of my comments already, but I think certainly there is a need for more kind of interdisciplinary work. And I think there's evidence that that's starting to happen, but I think there's certainly scope for more of that. And I guess gave some examples of, researchers certainly from different disciplines working together. I don't think we necessarily need more studies to say that athletes have negative emotions after injury. But if we can show, for instance, that when you do have negative emotions, that impacts your physiology, or that those fears or apprehensions, as I mentioned earlier, maybe impact things like movement mechanics. And to do that, we really need to draw on the expertise of people working with different backgrounds. If we're asking questions that are of more of an interdisciplinary nature, then we necessarily need to utilize and leverage the expertise of people in different areas. So I think that's certainly one thing. We also kind of talked about the importance of maybe greater communication between researchers and practitioners. I know, when I did my doctoral work in Australia, I studied at the University of Western Australia. And in Australia, and I think certainly in places like the UK, it's probably more commonplace to have more integration between sport and sports science. And, we used to have in Australia, cricket is quite a popular sport. And, I remember the cricketers, they call them the bowlers, like the pitchers, they put a lot of stress on their arms, and they were often coming in to get biomechanics assessments about their movement as they kind of, went through the motion of bowling. And there was, I think, perhaps greater integration in terms of the science and practice of sport than we might see in a North American context. So that's definitely another area, I suppose, where I think there's the possibility for progress. In terms of the research, I think there's also a lot of opportunities to use maybe more longitudinal kinds of approaches, where, as I talked a little bit with our study, I think, the nice thing was we didn't just measure emotion or, adherence or function at one time point, but we measured it over the course of rehabilitation as athletes were actually going through it. And that, from a practical standpoint, that can be challenging, but I think it's important to move certainly the research side of things forward so that we're getting better quality findings. And then another thing I would say is, to help us better understand mechanisms, certainly from a research standpoint, it's helpful when we have theories. So, just as an example, there's been a lot of interest lately in this idea of psychological readiness. And there's a number of tools out there to measure readiness. Like one was developed by physiotherapist Doug Glaser, and it's probably the most commonly used tool in practice. It's just a brief 6-item, very user-friendly questionnaire that asks athletes to rate the extent to which they feel confident to engage in certain activities or to do things like avoid re-injury. The problem there is in developing the instrument, there was no real effort to conceptualize what readiness actually is. In other words, we're trying to measure something before we actually know what we're measuring. And it may be, in some other studies, in a small qualitative study with my colleague Ross Wadey, we found that, athletes talked about other dimensions or components of what it means to be ready. So, for instance, they said, well, it's also related to your expectations. If you expect that you're going to come back and be ready to compete at a high level right away, then, maybe you're bound to be disappointed. Or, there may be beliefs that don't necessarily pertain specifically to confidence. And so I think that's where the theories can be really helpful, because they help point our attention to factors or to variables that might be relevant in trying to understand the nature of what we're looking at, and in helping us to make predictions about, for instance, well, does the athlete who's higher in psychological readiness, are they more likely to return or avoid re-injury or perform well? So I think, to move certainly the research side of things forward, it's important that we have those theories to help us better understand the phenomenon that we're looking at, to help us better explain why interventions may or may not work.
Sounds like a really great summary of research and interdisciplinary work. I'd like to take the theme of interdisciplinary and try to move it from the research vein to the practice vein. Where do we need to go in terms of interdisciplinary practice, the hands-on stuff, working with the athletes
Yeah.
as they recover?
Yeah. Again, I think, having mechanisms for communication between practitioners of different backgrounds. So, I know, John, you work at a pain clinic, and my understanding is you have the opportunity to collaborate with different practitioners of different backgrounds as you're working through any one particular case or working with a particular individual. And to whatever extent, I suppose that we can develop some communication mechanisms or opportunities and means for psychologists, or physical therapists, or nutritionists, or people who have strength and rehabilitation backgrounds to work together. I think that's really important. I recently had the chance to interview Dr. Rod Haverluck, and he's a biomechanist who's worked with countless swimmers, right? And he talked about, helping athletes become aware of how their shoulder movements and pull through the water may be contributing to injury, but also influencing their times. And I asked him, I said, well, when you point out these areas for change, how easy or difficult is it for the athlete to then implement that change to something that maybe they've been doing for a long time, and then to sustain that? And he said, it's tough. And so that's where, and he said, well, maybe you have insight into that. Right. So, and that's just as an example, if we can kind of bring together the expertise of people who have insights into behavior change or learning, right? Like, people in motor control or motor learning have better understanding of what are the processes in trying to relearn a skill, and how do you then retain that information, because learning is all about retention. And so, I think certainly in universities, when there's like sport institutes, you may already have that structure in place where there are practitioners that are housed within these settings, and that makes it easier to work together. I don't know if I have a great or clear answer on how that can happen in other contexts. For instance, in a high school, where you may have an athletic trainer, but you don't necessarily have a team sports psychologist or biomechanist, or but to whatever extent there are more interactions between people of different backgrounds, I think it's only going to benefit the applied work that we're doing with athletes. Yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on that yourself, but
I think that's a good summary. Just the idea of people working together in the lab, people working together in the field,
yeah,
and really trying to take the idea of team, which we all understand well as part of the sport environment, and working as a team ourselves, which seems like we should be able to do, given that there is a team ethic typically. So
yeah. Well, and maybe that's also kind of changing, right? Like just having the notion that it takes a team approach to really optimize that mindset, I think then creates the opportunity where it may be more likely to happen.
okay, one more question. Let's just try to look ahead, see where things might possibly go. And one thought I have would be to address this idea of team, or maybe a system, because there is a system that treats injury, and it involves a lot of people, as you pointed out, and it involves bringing research into practice. So as we look forward in an idealized way, perhaps to 10, 20 years from now, what would be the state of the art then? What would be the thing that would really make injury prevention and recovery work as well as it possibly could?
Yeah. Well, I think if we are to optimize our efforts to work more collaboratively or collectively as a team, both in practice and in research settings, then, I think we definitely need to create opportunities for interactions between people of different disciplines, where if there is any hesitation to working together, that people first of all can see the value and benefit for the athletes and for the end result. And I think as we're presenting and getting opportunities to show maybe, okay, well, here's some studies, for instance, or here's some numbers that show that when we incorporate this element into the program, that it seems to result or increases the likelihood of these kinds of outcomes. And so, I think if we're getting opportunities where we're able to communicate our value or worth, so to speak, that's maybe more likely to create synergies and a collaborative work where people are operating in team settings. I suppose, in kind of coming back to your initial question about the podcast, again, I think it's been really rewarding for me to see that when I do speak to physiotherapists, for instance, that they very much acknowledge, for instance, the importance of the psychological aspects of recovery. And like there's no apprehension in saying, well, we realize it's important. Some individuals also express they want more knowledge in that area. And so, I think if kind of in 20 or 30 years, if we start now to have more communication and opportunities to interact and show and demonstrate value for what we're doing, that there will be more multidisciplinary work, both in practice and in research. I also certainly think that hopefully in 20 or 30 years, that example of the Brian Clark study that I mentioned isn't the exception, but more the rule, where we have more and more studies where, again, we've combined expertise to show that when we implement certain interventions, that it can have meaningful clinical functional outcomes, right? And I guess, for injured athletes, that's what they want, or coaches, right? Like, can this help me get back better, stronger, to come back, or increase the likelihood that I do in fact come back? And so I think, like, if we can show that we're more likely to bring that about through collaborative research and practice, then I think that'll be indication that we have moved forward in the next 20 or 30 years.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Les, from taking us from then to now and giving us a look to the future.
Yeah, thanks, John, for, again, the chance to chat and just to consider and reflect on some of the work that you and I have done, and also, I guess, people in the field itself. So great to speak with you.